Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to start. We have a good group. I'll just let in the last few people from the waiting room. All right. Here we go. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to talk about one relatively new report and a report that's being released today. I will put the links in shortly. For people that want to listen in Ukrainian language, we have interpretation. So please, if you can, enable interpretation. And then we are using the Japanese channel. Here we go. To write in the Ukrainian version. So please, if you can switch on translation, it's enabled on the Japanese channel. Just a few things to say before I turn it over to Ksenia at NGORC and our other speakers. Link to the report from East SOS and from Refugees International is here. The report is live now. I am Nicholas No from Refugees International, Senior Fellow. Have been working for about 2.5 years now, specifically on the locally led response in Ukraine. We have a few other links that are relevant as well as we start the discussion. I'm just going to put into the chat also a link to the second annual Ukrainian Aid Leadership Conference that happened in March. There's some important update documents there from the summer and also from just last week about some important localization initiatives that are happening in Ukraine. So those are some coordinates for additional material. The Ukrainian version of our annual survey should be available in the coming hours. Hopefully that'll be up soon. It will be up on the same link as the report that's now available in English. We are recording this. We are doing it in a meeting format, not a webinar format. So we invite people to please ask questions in the chat, raise your hand, but we're going to address questions and call on people if you want to be called on video or off at the end of the remarks by the different speakers. So quick introductions. I already introduced myself, Nicholas No from Refugees International. Ksenia, why don't you introduce yourself?
Greetings, everyone. I'm Ksenia from Ukrainian NGO Resource Center. We are a Ukrainian organization working very closely on localization, but in general, building a better future through the support of civil society and NGOs in Ukraine.
And Yulia, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yulia Matvichuk. I am from East SOS Charitable Foundation, and it's Ukrainian NGOs that work from 2014. We're mostly working in humanitarian field, but do also human rights protection job. And one of our main advocacy field is localization process in Ukraine.
And Eva, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eva Vilichko, and I'm an independent consultant that supported the design, analysis, and drafting of this survey. That's it from me. Thank you.
So just 2 points before I turn it over to Ksenia and the presentation for the progress report for the baseline. One is that we called the report that East SOS and RI did an annual survey. That's in part because last year, or the summer rather, of 2023, Refugees International collaborated with ACAPS on a perceptions of localization in the response report that came out. This year, we worked with East SOS in order to kind of modify the report to make sure that it complemented the annual baselining report. The annual baseline, which first came out in the fall of 2023, has been enormously important in providing a kind of a baseline, but a series of metrics to measure key parts of the response and key indicators for localization year after year. It is mainly focused in some ways on perceptions of leadership, capacity, etc. What we try to do with East SOS and coordinating with NGORC and the Alliance of Ukrainian CSOs is to fill in some of the other parts, some of the other metrics that we all think are really important to adequately assess localization and really adequately assess the response as a whole. And this means asking data points like, how much of your budget did you transfer to your Ukrainian implementing partners? Do you have a funded position for cluster coordination, etc.? More kind of data-driven points. Also broken down by the different categories of the response. So donors, INGOs, UN agencies, and Ukrainian NGOs as well. And then a last part of what I think the survey brings, which is recommendations. Recommendations for specific ways that we think some of the problems and some of the also potential, some of the progress as well, could be accelerated or realized. Some of the problems could be addressed in the coming period. So that's a strong part, I think, of our annual survey. Now, next year, the Ukrainian organizations that are here, NGORC, East SOS, the Alliance of Ukrainian CSOs, they may choose to take this reporting and monitoring in many different directions. And we're going to support the Ukrainian organizations in whichever way they feel it should be taken, which is exciting. But it does raise a continuing problem, which has been identified, I think, by both reports, which is the lack of adequate, publicly accessible data about this response. You know, what East SOS and ourselves and NGORC and their partners have done, a lot of it is based on the goodwill and time, valuable time of respondents, of interviewees, of others that are involved in the response. It's hard to verify information. It's clear that globally and in Ukraine, there needs to be a much more robust mechanism for monitoring, reporting, and evaluating. And I'll just say a last point, which before I turn it over to Ksenia, which is if there's a kind of a framing that I would want to have folks think about over this next hour or so as we discuss these two reports, a real point of commonality among many between the two reports. I think it's fair to say that both of us found that there has been progress in terms of localization. There has been progress on putting Ukrainian organizations, Ukrainian actors, and Ukrainians front and center in this response. There has been. But 3 years into this response, entering the fourth year, really, of the response, $10 billion in tracked international aid for humanitarian programs since the full-scale Russian invasion. There has been far too little progress at far too slow a pace on a number of metrics compared to where Ukraine and this response should be at right now. And that's unfortunate. There is time, but it's going to take bold action and some courageous decision amongst all the different actors to try to transition more quickly to a Ukrainian-led response. So we'll go into some of those recommendations and findings, but Ksenia, the floor is yours, and very happy to hear details about the annual progress report, the baseline. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. I'll start with posting the links to the full report and the previous baseline in the chat, and I will start sharing my screen. I will, I don't have a lot of time, so I do want people to be able to check the full document later if you have not seen it yet. So we have started with the initiative of Humanitarian Localization Baseline for Ukraine in 2022. In 2023, we have published our first report, and this year we did an update or a progress report. We worked with localization measurement framework, and this is a methodology that has been developed by Humanitarian Advisory Group and Pianco, which tries to conduct a holistic measurement of progress in localization. within these 7 domains that you see on the screen right now. This approach has been applied in different humanitarian contexts before Ukraine. In Pacific Island, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen. It is now being done also in Iraq and West Africa. So it also allows us to get to be able to compare using the same methodology, to be able to compare the results, the localization evidence in different humanitarian contexts. We did it in this year. We did a small comparison. I will not talk about it right now, or today, but I do encourage you to check the full report for this. Yeah, I hope that my introduction of the baseline progress report will provide important context for my colleagues to follow with more data. And as we'll see right now, it is very much about the sorts and perceptions of different actors. Especially this year, we have reached a lot of national actors. I'm very happy with that. So in total, 279 respondents were interviewed. Most of them, you can see the breakdown as national actors. What is important for me to know that all respondents worked in humanitarian sphere for over 6 months and held senior positions. Reaching a large number of respondents is also, once again, important for us because this research is very much based on perception of people, and we really want the results to be representative of the situation we have on the ground. I will focus a little bit more on the portrait of national actors who participated. I'm very happy with the breakdown we got this year. Reaching a bigger number of national actors compared to last year allowed us to analyze data based on the size of organization or number of employees, based on what is its new or experienced organization, how long do they work within humanitarian response, and based on the regions where the organization operates. Is it local, only working in one region? Is it regional or national organization? This is basically the key findings of progress report compared to the baseline. You can see yourself, but we have identified progress within 5 of 7 domains that we look at. So we have seen progress under partnership, coordination, complementarity, funding, policy influence, and participation. Unfortunately, the level of evidence for localization within leadership and capacity domains remains the same, on the same level as last year. I will not elaborate right now because I will talk on each of the areas separately. So starting with partnership, some key points. The fairness ethics of partnerships have been increasingly emphasized. We consider this a great progress, and it really matters a lot. And we talked a lot about partnership during this last couple of years. So it's nice to see this result. We also see the continuing development of long-term strategic partnerships, which is logical at this point in the response. However, some decision-making disparities still persist between international and national actors. Let's look more into that. So we asked both international and national actors, are you or is your national actor involved in the decision-making processes within partnerships? And we see here that there is a notable increase of international actors stating that they always involve national actors in such processes, especially compared to the year 2023. While international actors claim that they involve local and national actors all the time, and mostly only half of national actors or Ukrainian respondents have the same perception. It changed only slightly, to slightly better compared to last year. So also, once again, stressing that this report is very much based on perceptions, and sometimes we see these disparities between the perception of international actors and national actors. We also asked about funding within partnerships, because we understand that the quality, the equity of partnerships can be seen a little bit through the lens of funding. Unfortunately, here we don't have as the results as we would like to see them ideally. So we see that most Ukrainian organizations do not always have their administrative costs covered, similarly to capacity and support costs. Especially important for us that only 9% of national actors report always receiving overhead costs. There has been a lot of discussion within a humanitarian community on the importance of overheads, and I don't want to stress on that once again, but we really expected this to have a little bit of a different results. Yeah, and also important to note for me that national organizations with the lowest number of partnerships, so those who have only 2 partners or less, they remain the most vulnerable in terms of funding from international actors. So they are the ones who usually do not get like administrative support or capacity costs covered, or not even talking about overheads. So moving on to leadership, as I mentioned, unfortunately, we did not see the progress, the evidence of progress within the leadership domain this year. We do see that national actors show more involvement in the decision-making locally, more involvement compared to the last year, and they consider themselves leaders in terms of leaders locally in terms of humanitarian response, but there have been some digression in the other ways. We see only limited efforts from international organizations to bolster national leadership. For example, what we talk about here is we asked national actors how often do they meet with their international partners, donors, and especially institutional donors. Actually, more than half of organizations, again, with up to 2 partnerships, never met an institutional donor. Also, this year, we have discovered that compared to the last year, even less percentage of international organizations facilitate meetings with institutional donors, so between their local partners and donors. It's somehow dropped compared to last year. Yeah, moving on to coordination and complementarity. So we see a little bit of progress in this area, very important, both in terms of we see a larger number of national representation on the meetings, on the coordination meeting mechanisms, but we also see that complementarity of roles between national and international actors still need like more straightforward parameters. We also noted that language barrier remains very often language remains a barrier in coordination forums, and actually we have seen even a decrease of usage of Ukrainian language reported by both international and national actors in coordination forums. So, but more importantly, so first, I wanted to note that once again, smaller organizations and more local national organizations are less inclined to join and participate in coordination meetings. It is only 1 in 4 local organizations, so the organization working in one region participate in coordination in general. And it is concerning because they are very often the ones who have directly links with communities and beneficiaries. But maybe more importantly, we asked everyone do you feel that your ideas or suggestions are heard in coordination forums when you do participate? And here we see more positive results, probably because we see that even those small organizations or small or more local organizations, once they do participate, they have a chance to be heard, and this reporting on this question even increased compared to the previous year. So just an important point for the local actors regarding coordination. Yeah, it is difficult. You need resources. It is very much connected to funding partnerships and other areas if organizations have an opportunity to participate in coordination. But definitely a good progress is that if you do participate, your voices and ideas will be heard. Funding, of course, very interesting for everyone. I think provides very important context once again, considering what my colleagues will be talking about after. We have seen online increase in access to direct funding for national actors. We know this, unfortunately. We do see the situation where the funding remains distributed unfairly, with the largest percentage proportion of funding going to international actors. And we have also, once again, similarly to last year, we see that most local NGOs lack the financial stability for sustained operations. So just to elaborate a little bit more, here is a breakdown when we talk about fairness of funding or unfairness of funding. Only 20% of international and 16% of national actors believe that the proportion of funding is fair. Very similar to last year, the situation did not change drastically, but here it's important that we do see national actors agreeing almost completely on these points. And really an important important point on financial stability. We see that actually about half of national actors do not see the organization and as financially stable, or let's say more positively, half of national organizations do say that their organization is financially stable, and it is the same practically data as last year. So the percentage remained almost unchanged. We do see a big difference for international actors because their financial stability decreased a little bit. But once again, I wanted to add that we also asked to follow up on this. We asked organizations, do you have funding in your bank account for the next 3 months? And only 1 in 5 national organizations stated that they do have funding in the bank account for the next 3 months. Only 1 in 5, while half of them think they are financially stable. For the international actors, it is very different because although 90% of NGOs said they have an operational budget for the next 3 months, not all of this 80% considers themselves financially stable. So once again, just underlining that the perception of international and national actors on certain issues differ a lot. Then we move to capacity. One of the strongest areas where we see the strongest evidence of localization. Unfortunately, not a lot of progress on this, but it was the strongest area last year and remains so. Why we don't have like a very visible progress? Because on some points we moved positively, on some we moved back. So we actually see the decrease of evidence of use of local capacity over international expertise. But we do have a very positive report that international actors do not undermine the capacity of national actors, and a lot of the views on capacity in general between international and national actors are similar. For example, here we asked the respondents who defines the capacity and the capacity needs of local and national actors, and the majority of respondents said that it is mostly a combination of both. It is jointly determined. Of course, I want to mention some negative aspects of international support as provided by our key informants, and I think I will not say anything new for you, but still, so it is the short project timeframes, which means that national organizations do not have sufficient time to work or to increase their capacity. It is repetitive trainings that are very often a problem when we are not moving actually in the positive direction on capacity, but just repeating the same stuff. And some big organization or national organization said about the inability to provide targeted, advanced knowledge and skills to support specific capacity training that they already as larger or more developed organizations need. And jumping to the next area, which is policy influence. Once again, it is this year one of the lowest areas, so having the lowest evidence of localization. We see that national actors are primarily involved in implementing rather than shaping humanitarian policy. We do have some progress. We see that local and national actors have slightly increased influence on donor priorities in country. I want to mention that we see that our respondents and in general, we understand that policy influence is not an easy thing to tackle. It is a thing not a lot of organizations have influence, but just to compare, to look at it once again, the proportion of respondents who say that they always or mostly influence humanitarian policy, it decreased from last year for both international and national actors. Of course, still the share of international actors that have or feels that they have influence is bigger than compared to national actors. But when we asked those who said they never or rarely have an influence on humanitarian policies, we asked if they would like to be more involved into these processes of shaping or planning humanitarian response. Almost all of them, 98% of respondents said they wanted to be more involved. Last area, very quickly, I don't want to get more time, but it is very important for us. Participation, the strongest, one of the strongest areas, once again, similarly to last year, and have showing a lot of progress, showing visible progress compared to last year. So we have a strong evidence of communities having increased opportunities to shape programming, but we still see gaps that remains between international and national organizations in terms of considering the needs of affected population. We understand that this gap is natural, with national and local organization being closer to the affected communities, of course. But just to look at it once again, look at the progress, especially within this top line that says that they all the time consider affected people's opinion during the design and implementation of programs in Ukraine. We see this data growing both for national and international actors. National actors grew significantly, increasing to 80% who do it all the time. International actors also noted an improvement, and again, from key informant interviews, we know that within this area, international organizations rely primarily on coordination mechanism and great involvement of national actors. So they also building stronger links with national actors have allowed them to improve on this. So this is all from me. I understand that it's a lot of information. within a limited amount of time. But I think when my colleagues will continue this conversation, drawing back to some of the evidences, some of the context I have provided, I think it will be easier for you to like structure and digest this information. And also, once again, just check the full report. It's a lot more there. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. I'll let in some other folks here as well. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to give some of the main points, findings, recommendations from our survey, our annual survey, and then I'm going to turn it over to Yulia and then to Eva to detail a bit more, or a lot more actually. But just to sort of overall framing, first thing is that there was really strong participation this year compared to the previous year when RI and ACAPS collaborated. In 2023, we had no UN agencies that were willing to share any data. This year, we had 7 UN agencies, and I think there's particularly strong support, or the reason why was strong support by OCHA, but also strong support within these UN agencies, almost the majority of which now have localization focal points, majority of which now have localization strategies, some of which have been developed with Ukrainian organizations, some of which have not. Also, the Humanitarian NGO platform was very supportive of the survey and did some great outreach with its members. We had 20 INGOs responding, and also strong interest by donors as well. So I think we had 6 donors. Across the UN agencies, donors, and INGOs, I think we got really a representative survey. They represent collectively about 60% of overall humanitarian spending in 2023. So it's a fairly representative sample. Yulia also will detail some of the findings from our survey of Ukrainian organizations, which I think is much more representative in the baseline, which interviewed, hundreds of different organizations, as well as by some other reports from Philanthropy in Ukraine and Jednania also, who have done a lot of work with Ukrainian organizations, their perceptions, their reality of work in this humanitarian response. But when it comes to the donors, INGOs, and UN agencies, I think we got a really representative sample. It's clear, however, that this kind of, let's say, data collection needs to be much more robust and publicly available, not through, advocacy organizations or operational NGOs that are working in Ukraine, but rather as a standard part of doing business in Ukraine and across the world. We all know, I think, the limitations of the financial tracking system by the UN that needs to be vastly improved, and there's a lot of proposals in that regard. I would also just point out that the Humanitarian NGO platform has an excellent proposal to require or to have its members regularly report data that's important for everyone to assess the humanitarian response. 2 points is that, yes, there is a lot of reporting requirements, but what we did find in this survey is that INGOs and UN agencies are collecting this data anyway. There is a lot known about their partnerships. There is a lot of detail that's known about how those partnerships are being conducted, the problems, the opportunities, etc. The other thing is that the NGO platform has a membership base, but it won't be able to capture non-members. So there's a clear need for better reporting, more robust, and more public. As I said, and I think Ksenia's highlighted as well, not all the trends are negative. There are a number of really positive trends, including in our report that we detail. Some of them are not related to the survey findings specifically, but related to the kind of macro data. I'd point out one particular area is the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, the largest country-based pool fund run by OCHA in the world. $500 million, I think, will be out the door by next year. They have made significant progress from the first year. I think, at the latest data that I saw, probably almost close to 50%, if you include some pass-throughs, much more than 50% of funding is flowing directly to Ukrainian organizations, with only, I think, 1%, 2% flowing to re-granting to other UN agencies. At the beginning, in 2022, a third of the money was going to other UN agencies. So real improvements at the UHF, a lot of funding going out to Ukrainian organizations. And that's an area in our recommendations that we say with donors should be a main focal point, especially if they can continue to get more funding out to Ukrainian organizations. USAID also stands out in some ways as now having a number of Ukrainian direct grantee recipients. They are working on onboarding a bunch more. That has been a big change, I think, since 2022 into 2023. Unfortunately, in the survey, we found that it was very limited, unfortunately, to find donors directly funding Ukrainian organizations. And that's a recommendation that we'll come back to in a second. But also on the positive side, a lot more awareness, of course, about the need and importance of locally led response, localization focal points, strategies, oftentimes with INGOs being developed with their Ukrainian partners. There appears to be a lot of progress in regards, especially with INGOs, when it comes to providing overheads and duty of care. But this then again goes to the core problem, which is it was very hard for us to assess and verify the extent and the details about how much duty of care and in which ways was being offered to which partners, to what extent was overhead or PSC being realized by Ukrainian implementing partners. We found a number of INGOs and half of UN agencies that are already engaging in some kind of passporting of vetting, which has been something that Ukrainian organizations have been talking about since day one, of trying to, at least between UN agencies or between INGOs that are in a consortium, to ease the vetting requirements between these different entities. There is progress in that regard, although it's unclear to us why half of the UN agencies are using some of the passporting mechanisms and half of them are not. So that seems like a clear area for improvement. But I'll just circle back to the direct funding part, because that is routinely brought up as a key metric around the world. We're almost 3 years into the response, going into the 4th year, more than $10 billion of internationally tracked humanitarian financing, and still less than 1% has gone directly to Ukrainian actors, 0.8% to be precise. Now, that's a bit better than 0.003% that was identified in the summer of 2022, but it is still, incredibly limited. There has been a surge of funding going directly to Ukrainian partners tracked by FTS in the last few months, which is good, but even that barely breaks 1%. It means that over the last few months, 1.4% of funding is going directly to Ukrainian actors. And direct funding is crucial. It's crucial for giving Ukrainian organizations freedom of flexibility, giving them good overheads, good PSC support, building their capacity, building their independence, and really staking themselves on leadership front and center. Cash voucher assistance, again, around 3%. It's the largest part of the response. Less than 3% is handled end-to-end by Ukrainian actors. And this leads to where some things may be able to change. One thing is on the donor reluctance to fund Ukrainian organizations directly. And I'll just put 2 points on that came from this survey. Number one is the legal requirements. We've heard, and I'll specifically single out DG ECHO here, for several years that DG ECHO cannot provide funding directly to Ukrainian actors. Well, we took a deep look at this, including with people that are directly knowledgeable of the various regulations. And actually, that's not exactly the case. It is not a requirement under EU law that a Ukrainian organization be headquartered in a EU member state. A Ukrainian organization, in order to be able to get DG ECHO funding directly, need only have a representative office, a satellite office, in any one of the EU member states. Now, this may take some time for Ukrainian organizations to get direct funding from DG ECHO. I personally wish that this process would have been started a year or two ago. Hopefully, it will start in earnest now, because it's clear under the regulations that there are pathways. I'll give you another example, which is a kind of, seems like a workaround, but we interviewed one major EU state that said categorically, we cannot fund Ukrainian organizations directly. Can't happen. We came back to them 2 weeks later, having interviewed a different ministry of the same government who is directly funding at least one Ukrainian humanitarian NGO. So this is a case within the same government where different entities are finding pathways to directly fund Ukrainian organizations. And then just a last point on this, which I think is really something that is really important from this survey. For 2.5, 3 years, I think we've all in this space have believed and certainly hoped that the humanitarian response has been able to avoid corruption, has been able to avoid illicit aid diversion for corrupt purposes. And I think for the first time, we have some data points across 32 UN agencies, INGOs, and donors, again, representing more than 60% of the overall response. We found no confirmed substantial case of corruption by Ukrainian implementing partners, by Ukrainian NGOs. That, I think, is a substantial point to the credit of Ukrainians, as well as to the international systems that have been put into place. Ukraine is now probably one of the most monitored, audited, spot-checked responses in modern history. And Ukrainian organizations, specifically, have passed this test with flying colors till now. It doesn't mean that there isn't corruption in the sector, doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, but we think it's an important data point that amongst 32 different respondents, we did not find a single case of confirmed substantial corruption. This should give donors much more, let's say, comfort when they try to expand this next year, as we hope, direct funding for Ukrainian organizations. And I think that Ukrainian organizations as well, especially, given the history of Ukrainian civil society, I think that they will continue to build out strong anti-corruption mechanisms. And indeed, that's one of our recommendations. I'll just close before turning it over to Yulia, just with a few other points from our survey here, which is online. I'll just share the screen right now. There we go. So a lot of findings that people can get into. I think for the UN agencies, some of the important things that we found, there's extensive tracking about these quality of partnership metrics, but a lot of it isn't shared. Most of it is not shared. It's not shared sometimes with other UN agencies, and it's not shared with donors. In fact, we found that donors sometimes don't even ask. There has been progress on overhead and duty of care, but again, unclear the degree to which that's actually penetrated. Unfortunately, with INGOs and UN agencies, we did not find evidence that there has been progress when it comes to staff poaching, which is a key issue for Ukrainian organizations, especially given the salary differentials. We didn't find a lot of changes or progress in the ability for multi-year funding. We have some recommendations in that regard. And also, it did seem that even though UN agencies are doing a very good job of getting feedback from their partners, compared to INGOs, they don't view their Ukrainian partners, let's say, as strategic partners, as co-creators of programs, as much as INGOs. Indeed, when it came to the country-level strategy, the overall one, only one agency involved a Ukrainian organization. When it comes to INGOs, and I'll just close there, like many of us know, the majority of INGOs had no presence in Ukraine at all before the war. I'd say the majority probably had very scaled down presence as well. Unfortunately, one thing that has been criticized globally, it's a tiny minority, but 4 INGOs said that they are setting up an entity to apply for funding as a local organization. And that's something that's been raised as problematic in the localization discussions for quite some time. And then a number of other findings. I just kind of close with interesting, which I think needs to get more data and more research, which is in 2022, I think at least in terms of Refugees International's reporting, we found a lot more concern and incidences of neutrality, impartiality, let's say violations or challenges to that, certainly differences. It does appear as though, almost 3 years into this response, that this concern is not as prominent as it once was amongst INGOs especially. Again, I think that needs more data, but that may point to the idea that a lot of Ukrainian NGOs and INGOs, especially in UN agencies, have really adjusted to these international norms or some of the other rubrics that are generally practiced, which is interesting. But again, with UN agencies and INGOs, no substantial confirmed case of corruption was reported amongst Ukrainian NGO partners. So I will leave it at that and turn it over to Yulia for some of your observations, findings, recommendations, please.
Thank you, Nicholas. And first important thing that I want to start with is that during our survey with national organization, the problems that national organization reported to us were repeated from organization to organization. And many organizations spoke about common things in different ways. So we decided to gather some of the main issues that we were discussed with them and that we think that important to highlight regarding to the state of localization process in Ukraine. So first topic that we discussed mostly is bureaucracy and reporting issues. And all of the local and national organizations that we talked to highlighted significant difficulties with bureaucratic procedures, especially related to the due diligence procedures and monitoring, that often slowed the speed and proper of aid delivery and launching the projects. So unfortunately, the negotiation period for grants can sometimes take up to a year, and from the initiative of the grants till have the money of the grant can change the situation in Ukraine. Most organizations also mentioned unreasonable and inappropriate requests from donors, such as data that was not collected from the beginning or photos that violate the dignity of beneficiaries. For example, photo with humanitarian aid that people are holding, and as well as lack of direct contact with donors on a specific project that also were raised by local and national NGOs. Second topic that we discuss is understanding of the Ukrainian context and lack of adaptability of the projects. Local NGOs said that not always was taken into account the context of the Ukrainian context, and unfortunately, international NGOs, being driven by their own strategic priorities, didn't want to change some projects to Ukrainian reality. We also had reported about some strategic sessions and trainings for Ukrainian NGOs that were adapted from humanitarian response in Iran and Somalia, whereas the difference in context were not taken into account, and some trainers, they didn't change the process of trainers regarding to Ukrainian reality. Third thing that I want to highlight is actually lack of direct contact with donors, delayed projects and payments, and lack of influence. Ukrainian NGOs mostly communicate only with their international partners and not with the donor of a specific project. This makes it difficult to change the project when it's needed. And one Ukrainian responder described a case where in the context of 3 months project, the focal point was not identified by international NGO until the end of the first month, and after which they couldn't talk with their international donor actually and change the project when it was needed. Delayed payments from international NGOs and UN agencies were regularly reported by local NGOs, and they had difficulties with implemented programs. For example, one Ukrainian NGO reported delays in payments from international donor, which caused the postponement of important assistance for IDPs for 3 months from the beginning of the project. And the last thing that I want to highlight is actually lack of multi-year funding and long-term planning. and that means that Ukrainian and local NGOs, they can't prioritize their temporary measures, and despite the humanitarian and localization principles, to build capacity of communities and beneficiaries. That also means that they can't have enough staff that are well trained and know all the situation about Ukrainian NGOs and Ukrainian context, and that means that they need to change their staff very often. And we highlight three main recommendations in our report. Actually, first, that Nicholas mentions about anti-corruption system, and we think that it's also very important to build from the side of local and national NGOs anti-corruption system and procedures that can have this project controlled and monitored by donors and international NGOs. Second thing that we highlight is that Ukrainians must take the lead in procedure relevant researches and monitoring response as a whole, because mostly researches that were done in previous years were led by international NGOs, not by Ukrainian ones, and it means that we need to take a lead and start to do our own Ukrainian lead response survey. And third recommendation that we put in our report actually is to ensure that smaller and local NGOs, they have a seat at the table and they can take part in cluster system and coordination centers and have their voice and tell what is really going on the field and describe how it is going. So from Ukrainian NGOs, that's it. And I think, Nicholas, the table is yours, or maybe Eva can keep going.
Eva.
Thanks a lot, everyone. I will very briefly speak on 2 points that I wanted to elaborate on, and one was already mentioned, is donor policies and requirements, and then I would like to follow up a bit more on participation and coordination. So when it comes to donor policies, as Nicholas already mentioned, we know very well from our survey and publicly available data that there has been very limited progress in ensuring that national and local NGOs receive adequate funding. But we also know from the survey that the main challenge with this funding is not really lack of willingness. We know that 1/3 of the donors we have interviewed have already found some ways to fund Ukrainian NGOs directly, and further 1/3 has been actively looking for one. So there is willingness to fund NGOs directly. However, the main barrier that most of the donors have quoted that makes it very difficult for them is their own capacities. So very restricted donor capacities, including not having enough staff capacity to handle more contracts or smaller value contracts, which essentially means that because NGOs are cheaper, it's more difficult to fund them. But while many donors are looking for ways to do that, there are other things that they could be doing to ensure better tracking of how the funding they provide is distributed. So we know from the survey that none of the donors interviewed measure how much money the UN agencies they fund are further allocating to their implementing partners. Only 2 of the donors we interviewed were tracking the same measure for INGOs. So they knew how much money INGOs are distributing further, but none of them knew how much UN is distributing further and how the costs are really falling between UN and implementing partners. On top of that, there was only 1 donor that reported having any formal rules and regulations mandating fair partnership principles and how much money should be transferred or shared with Ukrainian responders. And the same donor also reported somehow only 1 regulating the amount of support and overhead costs, but only in the case when they were completely missing. So it was important for them that there are some overhead costs included for implementing partners, but they were not mandating how much or is there any minimum standard required. So there is a lot that could be done on side of the donors and that would be tracked to ensure that the funding is being distributed in a fair manner and that the implementing partners and local NGOs receive their fair share and the support, fair share of the funding, and also support and overhead costs. So our main two recommendations here are for donors to please mandate the international partners, their grantees, to implement those localization reforms and metrics, and to require those metrics to be shared with them and available in best case scenario publicly, and for UN and NGOs that are further distributing costs to make this data available and to share it for also learning and reporting purposes. The second point I wanted to speak on was coordination, and specifically how the cluster systems work. So we know that there has been increased representation and participation of national NGOs in the coordination activities. Ksenia also referred to that. We have seen the highest increase in participation metric of the baseline, right? 5 of 7 clusters we have interviewed reported that more than 50% of their members are local or national NGOs, and some of them consist up to 65% of local or national NGOs. At the same time, we know that INGOs consist more or less 40%, and UN more or less than 10, around 5-6% of cluster members. And we know that even this makeup is so disproportionate. We know that most of the coordination roles and activities within the cluster systems are being held by either UN or INGO representative, including that is then responsible for coordination, who is cluster member, strategy building within the cluster, and decision making. So even though we see that 6 clusters reported that their numbers, national partner numbers, have increased or stayed the same, and they all reported having increased participation and representation of national NGOs, only 2 said that at the same time the participation and representation of national NGOs in the decision-making bodies of the clusters, such as a strategic advisory group, etc., has increased. So there is a stark disproportion between increasing representation and participation and the impact the national NGOs have on strategy building, decision-making, and cluster priorities. So some of the best approaches we have seen here that clusters take on include including national NGOs as co-coordinators at national and local level, always providing translation during every meeting on both national and subnational levels, and always communicating in both Ukrainian and English. I must say most of the clusters are already doing that, but still not all of them. Ensuring funding for national NGOs to be able to sustain those coordination-related positions, and that's all for donors and for UN INGOs. We know that there is one large INGO that funds national partners to be sub-cluster coordinators, but that was the only example that we could find. And also just taking time once you are a cluster representative for those bilateral conversations and trust and relationship building with Ukrainian partners that could change the approach, the cluster approach, from coordinating national NGOs to actually supporting them. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva. And just to add something else in our report is now OCHA is leading an area-based coordination effort across 2 oblasts. Let's say from my perspective, this is a welcome effort that should hopefully try to move the coordination architecture closer to where Ukrainians themselves are coordinating. I think one of the other findings from our survey was that the Ukrainian organizations are widely coordinating amongst themselves. So the key recommendation going forward is not only to try to get more Ukrainians involved, especially in leadership in the cluster system and the internationally led mechanisms of coordination, but also to invest in area-based coordination and Ukrainian-led coordination mechanisms, many of which already exist and that are extremely important for the coordination of aid in any case. I just say two other recommendations that we have there, which go to the, I think, a key point, which Eva brought up about the limitations of donors. Again, one, I think we found in this survey that some of these limitations can be overcome. So DG ECHO is one area where that's something that can be overcome, we think. The second area is limited capacity. This is where there are two really crucial steps for Ukrainian organizations to take, hopefully supported by their international partners, which is, number one, the creation of nationally led pool funds, truly nationally led pool funds that can then re-grant smaller grants to Ukrainian organizations. Unfortunately, right now, there doesn't exist operating today such an example. There is, through the National Network for Local Philanthropy Development, in partnership with START, there is going to be a new pool fund that should be launched in the coming months. There should be a diverse ecosystem of Ukrainian-led pool funds. And this is a crucial area for donors to invest that does not take a lot of additional capacity to manage small grants. The other area is to create more operational consortia led by Ukrainian NGOs as primes. So in other words, our hope is that in the coming months, there isn't another $80 million, $100 million consortium announced that includes a bunch of INGOs as the primes and Ukrainian NGOs as the subs. Operational consortia should be congealed, should be brought together with the support of donors, and also ideally international NGOs as auxiliaries, as supporters, to try to create aid economies of scale. So I think I'll end with that. Ksenia, any comments or observations? Yulia, Eva, and please, if anyone has, we have some more time, so please, if anyone has any comments or questions, to raise your hand and we can call on folks. But we'd be glad to go a bit deeper into the baseline or the survey. But please, Ksenia, Yulia, Eva, any final thoughts or also any hands?
Yeah, I just want to mention that I see like the jointly looking at two reports. What I see is the added benefits of doing both is kind of we do not give answers to a lot of questions why. We give a lot of data, we give a great representation and a diverse representation and an analysis of the data, but sometimes when people ask why, it is very difficult to say why people have this or that perception. And I think the point that you have raised, for me, very important on funding, very important on coordination, very important what actually Yulia mentioned, what Ukrainian organizations say directly, the cases they're working with. They are very often like a reply to the question of why. So that is why, I just urge to go in depth on some of the cases that you brought up or some of the examples that you gave. It's it's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yulia or Eva, anything before I go to questions? Okay, so I'll just try to go in order. Yaroslav, I'll ask you to unmute.
Greetings and thank you for this great researching. And my question is, how do you think we as NGO society and or our government could prevent cases when international NGOs register in Ukraine like Ukrainian ones, and then inside the localization take money and again give money to local NGOs? So do you see any ways to prevent it?
Wait, can you explain? Sorry, I missed the question again. Just say it again, please.
Yeah, thank you. So if international organization which has connections to other organizations or consists of foreigners who worked previously in other UN structures or other ones, register as local Ukrainian organization and then give fundings to other Ukrainians or operate here like Ukrainian NGO. What things can prevent it from
Very
your point of
interesting question. Okay, I understand that now. I'm going to take two, and then we can have the panel respond. So Daria, your question, please, and then Martha, I'll ask you for your question.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the presentation. My question would be around the next steps. So practically, how can we as national organizations, international organizations, but also in a different capacities. For example, I'm speaking on behalf of CARE, and CARE is the co-chair of the Gender and Humanitarian Action Working Group, where this year we have come to develop a very similar set of recommendations, but they're mostly directed to funding some specific organizations like women's rights, for example, but overall they look very similar to what has been presented today. So what would be the best ways for us to align? I understand that we will be doing our own kind of advocacy and coordination from the organizations, like on an individual basis, but maybe is there something that we can jointly do either through the platform or with the alliance or in any other like capacity or group? What would be the best action points and the best maybe like fora and platforms that we can take it to? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Martha, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this report. So I actually had 3 questions in one, so I hope it doesn't add up too much. So firstly, I was just wondering, you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation ACAP's report, and I see that they're also on the call. I was just wondering just if you could clarify the relationship. So the report that was published by ACAP's in September, was it drawn on this data or was it or this baseline that you or some, yeah, just clarify that. It'd be interesting to understand. Then also just like I'm calling in on work for Nonviolent Peace Force, and we currently do sub-granting, and we do also a whole part of duty of care package. So, and we actually recently evaluated our partnerships approach. So I'm also in the chat sending our responsible partnerships to evaluation of having done partnerships, and actually our conclusions are quite similar to yours as well. So I was just wondering, some of your recommendations were speaking a lot to donors. Can you have some more, provide us some more recommendations for NGOs? So obviously we want to continue sub-granting this year, but we also, yeah, so any recommendations that are like towards NGOs that want to do this kind of work as for a donor, or not to replace donors, but I hope that makes sense. Because to echo Yaroslav's question, one of the main issues we faced were the risk of dependence, and also obviously our exit strategies to not exist in Ukraine, you know, to build up the already existing ecosystem of local organizations so we can slowly but steadily ease out. But then a lot of our sub-grantees responded that if it wasn't for MP's funding, we wouldn't be able to, you know, continue. So kind of just, yeah, how to speak to that exit strategy and the long-term vision while keeping supporting the local organizations. Thank you so much.
So I just dropped in the chat, the ACAP's report was from 2023. That was the summer of 2023. And then shortly, a few months after that, the first baseline report came out. So two separate things again there. And RI assisted or worked with ACAPS, and Eva at the time was the country director. I'm just going to post in here Oxfam's really important paper about how they are not exiting Ukraine. And I don't think anyone is asking international NGOs or UN agencies to exit. They have come up with a transition plan to support their Ukrainian partners, to put their Ukrainian partners in the front, and to really work with them for the long term. It's a really interesting kind of strategy. And it's something, Martha, that, you know, in our survey, we didn't see out of the 20 INGOs, a lot of them working on transition strategies. A few of them are, virtually no UN agencies are working on that. But that seems like, to your question, and also the lady from CARE, that seems like a crucial starting point, is start to plan with your Ukrainian partners. What does a transition look like? There may be significant budget cuts, right, this next year. I think most of our respondents expect that. The donors are saying that. Planning that out now is kind of our best recommendation to try to ease that process and to try and do it rationally. I would also just say, a few other things, overhead, duty of care. Is your organization, is your INGO meeting the IASC standards, the well-known kind of documentation and metrics on this? Staff poaching is a really tough issue for every organization. There is already approved by the HCT in 2023 an ethical hiring and recruitment guidelines document. That's something that everyone should be looking at and trying to take as seriously as possible. Multi-year funding, passporting and vetting requirements, these are all things for INGOs to get more involved in. But I'd say the main thing here, and I see Mila from the Alliance of Ukrainian CSOs is here, is my personal takeaway from these interviews is that if international actors can really start having deep conversations about this next period, about how you can transition your organization and also transition with your partner organizations, have those conversations as frankly and as soon as possible is really the best way to kind of prepare for this next steps. I'll let Eva, Yulia, Ksenia jump in on those three questions, please. I don't have to put you on the spot, but Ksenia,
okay.
yes.
I'll add, yeah. Okay, because yes, the most interesting is the kind of the next steps we are talking about, and I think and Eva and Nicholas mentioned some of the next best like good practices or something that they have talked to with donors and international organizations. For me, very important for us, for the local organizations, very important to talk with a wider group of Ukrainian NGOs about localization, to kind of raise awareness of some of the issues and the position and the capacities again, and the stronger side of Ukrainian organization within the humanitarian response. For international, my guess for international actors, a good way it is to support or increase, if possible, the representation of your partners, your national partners on in coordination, in maybe representing in front of donors or on international and national arenas. Yeah, of course. And I also wanted to mention Oxfam, because I think I haven't even seen them in the room. It is very important, if we are talking about some kind of exit strategy, to involve Ukrainian actors into kind of thinking about it and drafting it together, as is a good practice. When I have seen some people again doing like evaluating partnerships, or just doing kind of internal baselining or tracking of the partnership, or your own localization metrics or things like this.
I saw Oksana from East SOS and Mila as well. Feel free to jump in if you want. We'll go to Carolina and Alice, but just to the question, the first question about INGOs registering as local Ukrainian entities. As I said when I talked about this, only 4 out of 20 of the INGOs said that they are actively doing that. It is a really problematic practice that's debated around the world. I would say this is where you know, the recommendation is that Ukrainian organizations, Ukrainian coalitions, alliances with your government, with the UN, with INGOs, you need to, you know, you should address this because it is a source of tension in a lot of other responses. There's a big article in DevEx today about this. It is obviously going to be a heavy trend. We know, or we think, that the Trump administration and USAID are going to lead a specific kind of localization effort, probably one that's highly ideological. But there is concern that if they do focus more funding and resources on localization, that there will be more of this trend of international NGOs trying to create local entities. It's a problem. But again, that's something where that needs to be dealt with, I think, through dialogue amongst the different organizations. Carolina, we'll take your question, and then Alice.
Okay, I can't unmute myself. Great. Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone for the presentation. We're very excited to see this report coming up. My question is about corruption and anti-corruption policies. Thank you so much that you emphasize this in the report. It was very important for us. But there is still some controversy because so basically none of the structures don't have any heavy cases of corruption with the local agencies. At the same time, they, like UN agencies specifically, they are not willing to use even already existed passportizing strategies. And donors as well point out that corruption, it's like they see that corruption in local NGOs, there is a heavy risk than working with INGOs as a subcontractors. And in the recommendations, you're mentioning that you recommend the national and local NGOs to take a leadership into building the anti-corruption system. So do you think that it's still like the corruption is still an excuse and we might need more highlight those, that there is no heavy cases and that we are like fully controlling the situation, or at least trying? Or there is more about actually some policies or like formal procedures we need to build or to showcase to overcome this and to say that you can't use it as an excuse anymore?
Thank you. And Alice, we'll take your question, then we'll have some answers.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much to both NGORC and the partners that were working on the survey. I think the findings really chime with a lot of the conversations we've been having here, particularly the operationalization days that the Alliance ran on the endorsed strategy on supporting local leadership. So it's good to see that this is all aligned. But yeah, encouraged to continue doing these because I think they're a really helpful temperature check. It helps us keep momentum and lots of helpful challenge in there to the donors. So yeah, we'll definitely table this in the donor working group where we regularly talk about what we're doing and what more we can do. But I think this is also really helpful advocacy to our headquarters as well, because that is where a lot of the conditions are set of what we can and can't do. And then country teams are often trying to do the best we can within that. So we'll share this with our humanitarian department who own our global policy, but my question is what the global dissemination plan is. And then just because, as Cash mentioned in the recommendations, just a shout out to a forthcoming piece of work, which is being done by Open Space Works and Ground Truth Solutions, looking at the barriers and opportunities for the role of Ukrainian civil society in cash. So they're in the middle of a lot of data collection. There's a lot of key informant interviews. Many of you on the call might be involved in this piece of work, but I think that that's also going to allow us to have a really interesting conversation, which was already started by the Alliance on leadership and operational delivery and structures of cash, because yeah, I think this is a big challenge and needs some specific focus. So yeah, thanks very much.
Eva, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in to answer Carolina's question, and thanks so much for that. So I think we've mentioned a couple of times already that one of the really big findings is that there is absolutely zero evidence of any big corruption cases or any substantial corruption cases in the response reported neither by donors, by NGOs, or by the UN. However, despite that, 1/3 of interviewed donors indicated that they still believe there is a higher risk of aid diversion or corruption when working with local partners rather than with international partners. So despite there is no evidence for that, there is still a belief and the perception of national NGOs being having a higher risk of corruption. And what that means in reality is that this perception is not only donor specific, it's also some of UN agencies, some of NGOs also must share this perception, because there are certain number of UN agencies even and definitely NGOs that allow for this due diligence passporting. So there are a number of mechanisms that different organizations are trying out. Nothing, I think what we need is a lesson learned exercise on this in the Ukraine response that would be incredibly useful on how it worked so far, on the limited number of occasions that happened. At the same time, we still we know from donors that to the response of whether you allow for due diligence passporting, they would say, yes, of course. I mean, the primary grantees can allow for that. We have no problem. But while saying this, there is no mechanism for sharing any of responsibility in case something goes wrong. So even if donors allow for due diligence passporting, the main responsibility is still on the UN or the INGO that would not do the full due diligence process or skip it in order to facilitate funding for national NGOs, and they will bear all of the responsibility if there is an issue coming up with this funding. So we need a mechanism that would allow for sharing this responsibility and for taking on that something, if the whole due diligence exercise will not happen, if something goes wrong, the responsibility will be shared both by the primary grantee and the donor. And that does not exist right now. So there are many, as you said, also excuses. But I think the most important thing that we need is the lesson learned exercise, the mechanism to share responsibility, but also some sort of change of mentality. And that's definitely always the most difficult thing, because once we don't believe the evidence that the corruption is not there, and we still build a number of hoops for the national NGOs to jump, that is on us, on the international community, to not learning from the available evidence. And that also speaks to listening to more local voices, including more NGOs in the way that in a program development, strategy building, because the more you listen and learn from them, the more you will realize that this risk is actually very low. I hope that answers your question, Carolina. I see your hand is up again.
Please,
Well,
Carolina.
Thanks. Well, like 50-50, because the point is, yeah, so from where we can gain this lessons learned if no one willing to share the risk, and even like not share the risk, but like go for the direct funding. And even the case described in your research that there was a warehouse that was bombed and INGO covered for the partner. But so is it actually the risk of corruption, or that they don't want to spend their money in case of something goes wrong, and because they have a larger budget, so they're obviously like a local NGO would be never able to cover for the whole program gone wrong. Yeah, so just maybe it's a theoretical question, but I'm very interested like in point of advocacy, so to whom we should address this issue.
Eva, correct me if I'm wrong, but that example was where an INGO actually covered gave money to their implementing partner because a donor wouldn't cover that it was a warehouse that was destroyed. Actually, that was this kind of sequence. But we have these anecdotes across the board, right? I mean, I think everyone's familiar with these different examples. The question becomes, to your point, of how actually to change things and where. And I think our hope is, at least with this survey, that we have a data point that shows, despite the high perception of corruption and probably the high reality of corruption in your country, the humanitarian sector, the Ukrainian NGOs have done a really good job. And there's a lot of reasons why that I think we could all discuss for a while, but that needs to be understood and invested in. Carolina, I don't think it's an excuse on the part of donors, because I know in my own country, if there had been a substantial case of corruption by a Ukrainian NGO last year, probably, people would have jumped all over it in the US, and USAID would have been under some serious pressure for funding. So I think it is serious. I think it's going to continue to be serious, but let's get this information out at least. We have only 3 minutes left. Just anybody else that would like to make a comment or question?
Thank you so much. Maybe I could say just, first of all, I want to congratulate us as a country that more and more we start to be country which use a data use approach, and it's very important. I think this is a big deal. And there's another comment that we do this research in partnership together, Ukrainian international partners, and this is very useful and helpful for us because you as a partner ask us, what do you want? What do you want to explore? Who should be involved in this process? How we can do something together? And this is really great example of locally led approach because we are doing this together. And a lot of points, I love these points about corruption, and we should discuss this more, but I just, last month, I had a lot of conversation with donors and I asked them about corruption. I had this conversation when war started as well. And now I could compare that we are, like from inside, like Ukrainians, we more criticize us because we want to change something, because we see this from like as a citizen, and for us is really sometimes crazy topic, but as a partners who could compare the different countries' contexts, sometimes tell me like, Mila, but you should breathe because your country, and we believe in you more, and we see the progress, and we see that it could be changed, and you as a civil society really have made a great job. And we believe in you, and it's just worth. It's just not a database approach. It's just like a small talk, but I think it's this is a good for me. It's an inspiration, like for person who live in Ukraine and want to change something. When people from different countries, governmentals talk about this. So just don't want to, because wait the time. Thank you so much. I'm really proud, and it's really great to have such survey and report. So we should read it. We should have this book in our table. And so let's continue, because it's good to develop some paper document, but we should use it and continue to work with this, like with localization as well.
Mila, thank you very much. Thank you for your thoughts. I put in the Alliance of Ukrainian CSOs website there. I put in my email as well. Be glad to hear people follow up after they have time to digest the report. But Eva, Ksenia, Yulia, any final thoughts at all?
Just maybe like a conclusion from my side, and regarding to all questions that were raised, I think whatever will going on from international society and donor society side, someone needs to take lead and responsibility from Ukrainian side. So it's up to us how it will go, and all our recommendation to everyone is to support us, but we need to take this support to make localization process smoothly in Ukraine. So thank you everyone that you joined here.
Very well said. And thank you to our translators as well. Very appreciated. We're at time. So thank you all for joining us. Please, my email is there. Be glad to stay in touch. Let us know what you think about the report, and looking forward to next year with whatever these great organizations put together, and hoping some of these numbers change more. I think they're going to go in the right direction. So good luck in the next year also. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Yulia, thank you. We did it.
Yeah, thank you.
Co-creation it takes a little bit of time, this co-creation, co-authorship, but it works. It works. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah. Our pleasure. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
All right. Mila, we'll talk soon.
It was a
Have good
pleasure.
holiday,
Thank you.
everyone.
We'll talk soon. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.